How serious is the situation of a sovereign debt crisis in Swaziland?
I think it's very serious at this stage. Economic indicators that have come out in the past few weeks all point towards that sort of trend. You're looking at foreign reserves only being able to cover about 2.6 months of imports. The overall budget deficit for fiscal year March 2011 was about 14.5%, and your current account is forecast at about 18.5% of GDP last year. So all of those don't bode well for the country.
Okay, what's being proposed as a way to get out of the mess? We talk about austerity measures. The government must now slash salaries for a very bloated civil service.
Oh, well, currently the government is in a 6-month staff monitored program with the IMF, and hopefully, if all goes according to plan, that should pave the way for some sort of formal arrangement between Swaziland and the IMF. And as well, if Swaziland actually gets the letter of comfort from the IMF, it should open up the door for the country to receive funding from other multilateral organizations such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank as well.
What's the appetite to provide loans for a small country like Swaziland? And I'm talking about the fact that their reserve position is significantly compromised, and there's just a sense that the economy is not productive enough to generate income for them to pay back some of these loans.
I think the risk appetite isn't very good for Swaziland at this point. As I said earlier, the IMF, a lot is riding on that. If they get that letter of comfort, if they successfully go through their staff monitored program, that would open up the door for them and improve risk appetite for the country.
It's also been suggested that a bailout plan devised by the regional community, SADC, could be on the cards, but that South Africa should be prepared to, loosen up the purse strings a little bit.
I think a bailout obviously cannot be ruled out at this stage. I think the trend for Swaziland has been negative for so long. Yes, it could come from South Africa. Who would actually facilitate the entire program, I'm not entirely sure. But yes, I think it would bode well for regional stability if somebody's there to help the country out.
Were it to fall on the shoulders of SADC, is it feasible? I mean, South Africa could argue that although we're growing, we're not growing fast enough, and we've got our own internal problems in this country, unemployment above 24%, for instance, needing to create jobs, 500,000 per annum. The priorities ought to be inward-looking.
I think one has to take into consideration the fact that South Africa has very strong ties with Swaziland historically. As well, South Africa has a very strong business presence in in Swaziland. So something would have to be done to keep that economy going, because South Africa does have very strong ties with it.
Let's talk about how the government is dealing with the situation that's unfolding, and it's more of a political question to you. When we're seeing these civil servant protests and many more scheduled to come to the fore, the government's responded with brute force. And that's been quite disconcerting for others who believe that probably this entire issue around Swaziland's creditworthiness should open up a broader conversation about political reforms in Swaziland.
Well, I think the social uprisings was actually quite an upset to the Swaziland government. It was shut down majorly by the police officers and so forth in the country. Going forward, I think one might argue that the best way for Swaziland is perhaps to form a constitutional monarchy like we have in Lesotho, where you still have your king in place, but there is a democratic party that represents the people of the country, and hence the economic decisions for the country are ultimately determined by the people of the country.
Should the monarchy, in trying to find some kind of a détente with the public, also start to devise a strategy for economic reform beyond what the IMF is proposing? Are there key building blocks that are needed to really make the Swazi economy a lot more dynamic?
I think Swaziland does fall short in the fact that it's not as well endowed in resources as many of its other African counterparts. But they do have a fiscal adjustment roadmap in place that is being done in conjunction with the staff monitored program. And the final assessment of that program would come at the end of August. And I think a lot is riding on that. So once that happens, I think we'd have greater insight as to where the economy is going.